I'm delighted to welcome everybody here today as we celebrate the publication of Fit to Serve, the new memoir of our distinguished alumnus, James C. Hormel. Now, to say that Jim is a distinguished alumnus is one of the understatements of the year. Not that you're not distinguished, Jim, but you're much more than that. Jim's relationship to our school is much closer than the average graduate. After graduating from Chicago in 1958, Jim returned to Hyde Park in 1961 to serve as the law school's first full-time dean of students. And he served in that capacity until 1967, setting a standard that every dean of students, including Dean Gardner, is seeking to reach. After moving away to live in New York and San Francisco, Jim has remained extraordinarily active in the law school. He is one of only 4 life members of the law school's visiting committee. And Jim understands the importance of leadership and how important it was for Chicago to train lawyers in the public interest. In 1986, he established the James C. Hormel Public Service Program, which provides funds each year to support loan forgiveness for our graduates who want to work in government or in public service, other ways in public service and public interest law. Jim was a leader in that area, and indeed I'm really delighted that we're able to follow in his footsteps today as we expand the public service program in our law school. Jim's vision and his passion for public service has grown out of a life that is dedicated to advocacy for human rights and for social equality. Today you're going to hear Jim in his own words talk about his courage in waging a very public and ultimately successful campaign to become the first openly gay American to serve as an ambassador to a foreign country. But before this, Jim was a U.S. before he was ambassador to Luxembourg in 1999, he represented the U.S. at the 51st Human Rights Commission and was an alternative representative at the 51st delegation to the UN General Assembly. He's been active in the Democratic Party for many decades, and he's really nothing less than a giant in terms of philanthropy and engagement. His achievements are manifold, including helping to fund the Human Rights Campaign and the establishment of the largest LGBT literature library in the nation at the San Francisco Public Library. Jim has 5 children, 14 grandchildren, including one who graduated from the law school in 2002. And joining him on campus today is Michael Wen, a Chicago native, his partner. Jim's book, Fit to Serve, is a very personal and very candid description of his life, including his time here in Hyde Park. It was also the first book I ever read on a Kindle. And so, as I got it, I mean, and it was really a riveting book. As I'm going, my finger got tired from doing this constantly on my Kindle, so now I'm pacing myself. But we are absolutely delighted and privileged and proud, Jim, to welcome you back to your school, and I hope all of you will join me in giving Jim a warm welcome.
Well, thank you, my goodness. Thank you. Thank you. Well, this is a unique opportunity for me because I have not spoken to a group of students on this campus since 1967. So I'm very impressed with the numbers of seats that are filled here. I'm sure that it's because of my reputation as the Dean of Students. I was reminded earlier this morning that I was the person who admitted and who encouraged Bernadine Dorn to come to the law school as a student. I was not reminded that I was the person who admitted John Ashcroft to the law school. So there you go. That was a very generous introduction, Michael, and thank you so much. I really appreciate your kind words. But you point out things that I have been able to do in my life because of circumstances. And when I think of giants in philanthropy, I also think of those people who are doing what they can and who devote their voluntary efforts toward making life better for all of us. And that's what I hope that students at the University of Chicago will learn from their experience here, along with the incredible academic and intellectual opportunities that exist on this campus. You all are very fortunate, you as students at the University of Chicago, because this institution, above any other that I know, provides that kind of atmosphere to feed intellectual curiosity across all of the disciplines. And it's just a wonderful experience to be able to have here. So whether you know it or not, you are extremely blessed to be on this campus. The book, as Dean Schill mentioned, is called Fit to Serve. The title comes from the fact that during the period in which I sought the appointment as ambassador, no one ever questioned my qualifications for the job. Nobody ever raised any issues about my competency. The issues they raised had to do with the fact that I was a gay man and that others knew it. That in itself, I think, is a very interesting aspect of this whole situation. Don't Ask, Don't Tell, for example, was built upon the requirement by the federal government that people actually lie in order to serve the government, which I find amazing, just amazing. And nobody ever raised that, you know, as a factor in the, shall we say, illegitimacy of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was a piece of a policy that was simply outrageous and resulted in the loss of thousands of people in the military who were discharged, including, to my knowledge, at least 53 linguists who specialized in Arabic, who at a time when we desperately needed them, and discouraged who knows how many thousands of others from even considering going into military service. We don't consider the results of our prejudicial acts. But what happens almost always is that when we exclude people, we exclude the people whom we need to include. One of the problems about being gay historically in this country is that it was against the law. So back in the time that I was a student here, coming out was sort of an admission that you were a criminal, or at least what you did was criminal. And it wasn't until 1960 or 61 that Illinois became the first state to remove the so-called sodomy provisions from its criminal statute. So in Washington in the 50s and 60s, there was an active campaign to drum gay people out of the government. And it started at the State Department, ironically. It started at the State Department in the late 40s at the time of the House Un-American Activities Committee and people like Joe McCarthy who were discovering then that there were political advantages to pointing fingers. So for me to come through the State Department as an openly gay man and to actually get to a point of public service by that route was quite remarkable. On the other hand, the State Department by that time was more than ready to be supportive. And when I was nominated, it was very clear that the employees at the department would do whatever it took to support that nomination. And during the course of that period, I was frequently asked, how I felt about the process that I was being subjected to, and whether I had considered the ultimate value of my doing it, or whether I might just throw up my hands and say this isn't worth it. And I discovered that it was worth it at the State Department. I would go into that building, and every time I was there, somebody would find me and would come up to me and say, Mr. Hormel, I just want you to know how much we gay Foreign Service officers appreciate what you're doing. You have no idea what it means to us. And that was all one would need to hear in order to continue the process. But things were said that were outrageous, and they are, some of them are mentioned in the book. And they were things that were said by people who had no business saying them. For example, Senator Tim Hutchinson from Arkansas said that I was anti-Catholic, and that was based on the fact that there was a videotape of me attending a Gay Freedom Day parade in San Francisco and laughing at a joke that was being told about a group called the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Well, now, the thing is that the sisters were funny. And when I was asked to disavow them by Senator Hutchinson, I said, why should I do that? I said, in the first place, I didn't avow them. And in the second place, they're a 501c3 organization, and they're raising more money for HIV/AIDS than probably any organization in your home state. I didn't mention the fact that he had gone to Bob Jones University, and that Bob Jones Sr. and Bob Jones Jr. and Bob Jones III all had made statements implicating the Pope in Satanism. The Pope was described as an instrument of the devil by Bob Jones. So that's where he was educated. And the day that I was appointed ambassador, the day the appointment finally took effect, was the day that he was divorced by his wife for having an affair with one of his staff people. The other person who had a hold on my nomination was Jim Inhofe, who's still in the Senate, despite the fact that during this same period, his office, the security in his office crashed. All of his computers, and somebody came in to service them and discovered that they had crashed because of an overload of pornography. So I felt somewhat vindicated by those experiences. There are others which are mentioned in the book, and of course I encourage you to read it. Writing it was a bit traumatic because I wasn't prepared to reveal things about my personal life. I thought I was going to write a political memoir, but I was persuaded that the memoir was really fleshed out by the facts of my life. So I do discuss my childhood. I do discuss what it's like to try not to be gay, to do whatever one can not to be gay, to be married, to raise a family, to deal with the duplicity that one sets up for oneself, and to finally be confronted in a failed marriage with the facts of that deception. and then what it takes to rise above it and to discover oneself and to be willing to be public about it. It was not easy, and it still haunts me in a way. I think that the most important single act a gay person can do is to come out, for at least two reasons. One is that it relieves oneself of an enormous personal burden. And for those of you who aren't aware, carrying around the secret of one's sexuality becomes a heavier and heavier burden. Ironically, it's an issue that shouldn't be discussed. It really shouldn't, because it's nobody's business what your sexuality is. But in order to have any influence in the political process today, it's a necessary piece of the story. And we must let others know who we are, or they will fabricate who we are. And what they fabricate will not be true. So those are two very clear reasons, and I try to mention them in the book. Also, and sort of in conjunction with coming out, is the whole matter of whether being gay is a choice. And it's very interesting that a lot of people think it is. Just as a lot of people, a vast majority of the voters, think that gay people are not discriminated against in terms of jobs and housing. Whereas in 29 states, it's still legal to fire somebody for being gay. Someone was telling me the other day about a friend from Louisiana who called to say that she'd lost her job because her boss discovered she was a lesbian. And he said, well, you've got recourse. And she said, not in Louisiana. And she's right. And so long as the Employment Non-Discrimination Act languishes in Congress, where it has languished for almost 40 years, that's probably going to be the case in a vast number of states. Which also fascinates me because when you look at the corporate world, you will find that I think it is now 98 or maybe even 99% of the Fortune 500 companies have written into their hiring policies that there will be no discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So the corporate world is on top of this. The political world lags sadly behind. I'm reluctant to even bring up the so-called Defense of Marriage Act. It has received attention beyond its due. It's patently unconstitutional. I don't see any hands going up saying, no, no, no. It is. And the courts are reasoning that out in, right now, I think 9 different cases that are moving their way up. The opinions that have been written regarding DOMA are very carefully written and very carefully reasoned. And it's going to be very difficult, I think, for any court, including even today's U.S. Supreme Court in its present composition, to cast aside the reasoning in those opinions. In fact, in Lawrence versus Texas in 2003, Justice Scalia, in his dissent, suggested that by the terms of Lawrence v. Texas, it would be possible to argue for same-sex marriage. So I see I see things changing, and I see them changing in a very positive way, and I see them changing very soon. As people become aware that their children, their parents, their neighbors, their employers, their employees, their policemen, and so on, represent a constituency that is still discriminated against. And as that takes place, people will gravitate toward what is right. I really do believe it. So there will be another battle, and this will be a much different one. The battle to come is the battle that is still being fought by African Americans and by other minorities. And that is the battle for cultural acceptance. We all need to look at where we stand on issues of cultural acceptance. They are not discussed widely. They are sometimes covered academically, but in a very academic way. When we're talking about something which is deep and personal and rooted in our society. So I see the forthcoming battle as one in which the various representatives of minorities in this country will need to band together to make it clear that social justice is not complete until we have addressed the issue of cultural acceptance. It's an interesting premise. Can we do it? You know, the only majority in repressed groups in this country is women. The Equal Rights Amendment, I think, was drafted in 1920, and it has never been ratified. So here we are in 2012, and we still are not willing to include in our Constitution language that equalizes the standing of women in our society. And you must remember that the Constitution was written by white, straight males who owned property. And they were the only people who could vote originally. So the Constitution has amendments that qualify those requirements for voting. And they do say that women have the right to vote, but they don't say that women are equal. I hope that all of us will feel the passion to band together so that we can all live to see the day when all of us are culturally accepted and respected. So I'd really much prefer to hear from you, and I stand here ready to take your questions and comments. And I hope that you'll be forthcoming. Yes?
Can you maybe talk a little bit about your experiences as a gay man and an ambassador in that capacity? Did being gay affect your ability to be like a diplomat in any way? How did other countries that have different cultures confront that?
Well, it's interesting because such an issue was made of my sexuality, and I was not able to communicate about it directly. And the politicians in Luxembourg were not able to comment on it directly until it became a fact. So what people generally might not have realized is that whenever somebody is nominated to be an ambassador, before that nomination takes place publicly, the country to whom that person is being sent is asked, is this person acceptable to you? There's even a technical term called agrément. And when and if the president receives agrément from the country, then the vetting proceeds and it becomes public. So by the time people knew about my nomination, Luxembourg had already said, sure, he's okay with us. So I think that they were really, how can I say it, pissed off. You know, we are being denied an ambassador from the United States of America because he's gay. Who's making that decision for us? You know, that's not our decision. That's not the way we see it. So when I got there, when I actually arrived in Luxembourg, people went out of their way to welcome me. People went out of their way to work with me, and it made it a lot easier, in fact, for me to become a part of the diplomatic world there in a faster way than I might have otherwise. So I would say that I was helped in the long run. Yeah.
Hi. You talk in the book about the 1968 convention. Can you talk about how that changed some of your political perceptions?
Well, I was sort of in the process of change by 1968. In 1965, my wife and I separated. And during the next couple of years, as the war in Vietnam developed, I started having very strong feelings in opposition to the war. And then I started looking at my politics. I had been what one might call a liberal Republican. There aren't any anymore. But that's how I saw myself at the time. I had worked for the election of Charles Percy to be a senator from Illinois. And that was, I think, my last contact with the Republican Party. Because I started seeing changes, and indeed changes were taking place, because with the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65, people were leaving the Democratic Party in droves to become Republicans. And I think Lyndon Johnson commented on that, saying as he signed the Civil Rights Acts that he might have been signing the death warrant for the Democratic Party. Of course, I saw it in the opposite light. I saw that there was movement there toward the recognition and willingness to deal with social issues. And so that was shifting for me, but I wasn't satisfied even with that. And when I moved from here to New York in late 1967, I started seeing more of the foment that was taking place in different parts of the country, and I got caught up in it. And ultimately, in 1968, became the national director of an organization called the New Party. The New Party was an effort to, well, it began as an effort to encourage Eugene McCarthy to run as an independent candidate after he didn't get sufficient representation at the Democratic Convention. When he said no, funds had already been raised, and so it was decided to, put the New Party on as many ballots as we could get on and see what happened. Our presidential candidate was Dick Gregory. For those of you who don't know, Dick Gregory by that time had established himself as a political voice through his comedy routines. He was the first, I believe, the first black comedian to perform at a white club here in Chicago. The club was the Playboy Club. The time was like 1959 or thereabouts. And the night that he appeared as a substitute for somebody, there was a convention in town, and the club was filled with people from Mississippi. and Dick stood up in front of them, having been advised. And he said, I understand that some of you folks are from the South. He said, I love the South. He said, I spent 2 weeks there one night. There were a couple of chuckles in the room, and then he talked about going into a restaurant and sitting down and nobody coming over, and finally a waiter was walking by and he said, I'd like to order, and the waiter said, I'm sorry, we don't serve Negroes in here. And Dick said, well, that's okay, because I don't eat them. So then the tension started to break down, and that's how he became, the famous Dick Gregory. So he was our presidential candidate, and that didn't mean that we weren't taking ourselves seriously. We took ourselves very seriously. But I had the opportunity during that campaign to go to the kinds of debates that took place on a lesser scale than we're seeing right now. They weren't nearly as amusing either. And there was somebody representing the Republican Party and somebody representing the Democratic Party, somebody representing the American People's Party, I think it was called George Wallace, and me, speaking for the new party. And I found that all of the others were bound to a certain set of issues and comments, and I could say whatever I wanted. So it was a great time. Through that experience, I came to realize that the movement represented some of the very same problems that I had been concerned about in the major political parties. There was sexism, there was racism, there was homophobia, and it was, in the same ways it was being exhibited as it was elsewhere, which was very discouraging to me. I went away for a while. I actually moved to Hawaii and lived there for 4 years and sort of re-examined myself and my principles and what I stood for and what I cared about. And then I moved back to San Francisco. It was 1977. Anita Bryant had just succeeded in Florida in getting a measure passed in Miami-Dade County that would keep gay people from teaching in the public school system there. And that led to a movement in California to do the same thing statewide. That's how I got involved in politics. Yeah.
You mentioned how important cultural acceptance is to all minority groups, and it seems like both like an abstract concept as well as like a personal, everyday, daily thing, something that would really be valid. So like, how in particular for like the LGBT community can we go about like gaining cultural acceptance? Like, are there certain ways, like when you conceptualize that, do you think that there are certain ways we can do that, like legislation or just more on a more ground level?
I really don't know the answer to that. So much of our attitudes culturally is influenced by our societal institutions, including our religious institutions. And other parts of it are influenced by our exposure. If I were speaking to a room of Native Americans today, I don't know how they would react to that message, because they are simply not culturally accepted almost anywhere. And it's amazing, we came over and we took all of their land and said, okay, now you're going to live here and you're going to have this and then you're not going to have that. I mean, it's incredible. We've never really owned up to the damage we've done to other cultures, including the ones I mentioned earlier. But I think that we really need to look very carefully at how we behave. And when people talk about what would Jesus do, I don't think that Jesus would be doing what they think Jesus would be doing. Yeah.
You know, there continues to be a problem in the Senate with, you know, gay nominees coming through. And I think it doesn't seem to occur in the open anymore, but I think everyone sort of looks at the nomination of Edward Dumont to the federal circuit, which sort of sat in the Senate for months and months until he finally withdrew his name, as setting a pink ceiling with regard to judicial nominations, that there will be no gay judges outside of the Northern District of California and the Southern District of New York. And I was wondering if you could comment on, you know, whether you think that's true and what you think about the sort of, the fact that this is now happening, but it's not, it's happening in a very different way. It's happening in a way of, that is sort of sub silentio, and so there is no longer this sort of way of sort of pointing to one senator's, you know, anonymous hold and saying, this is what this is really about.
I think that in terms of judicial or cabinet or other appointments, the trend is clear. Even though it's a small trend, it's clear. I don't think that will be long before you see gay members of circuit courts, or perhaps even the Supreme Court. Yesterday, Governor Christie in New Jersey appointed a gay man to the New Jersey Supreme Court. Of course, today he said that he would veto legislation that would promote same-sex marriage. So Governor Christie is part of the way there. But I do think that all of these changes are coming, and I'm very optimistic. And if I weren't, I'd probably be crying. Yeah.
Would you implement any change, policy or whatever in high schools, primary schools, universities in order to promote non-discrimination? And if so, what policy measure change would that be? Is there a role for universities or high schools to, in this matter, and is there anything that universities or high schools could do in order to promote non-discrimination?
I'm not totally clear on what you're asking, but I think that you are bringing into focus something that I hadn't mentioned before, which is organizations like the Gay Straight Alliance, Gay Straight Alliances, which didn't exist 10 years ago and are now almost a routine part of any high school campus organization activity. And what's that leading to? Well, it's certainly leading to changes in attitude. It's leading to general conversations regarding bullying, which also just weren't taking place until a few very short years ago. It's leading to people rethinking about how their kids are being brought up. And actually, their kids are coming home and saying things to them, you know, like, you're off base, or you don't know what you're talking about, as kids can say to their parents. But they're saying it with some rationale behind it. So in those areas, I see change happening as on a day-by-day basis. I don't know whether I'm touching on what you were asking.
Is there anything in particular that you would like to implement in either universities or high schools in order to promote non-discrimination?
Do I have? I have the feeling that things are progressing in a way that will handle themselves ultimately. But here again, you know, it comes down to cultural acceptance. It pains me greatly to read about gangs and what they do to each other and how self-destructive they are, and how they come out of a feeling of frustration with the cultural setting in which they exist. And this is how some young people learn or think they're dealing with their circumstances, when in fact it's only, prolonging the situation. So there are elements of the community that I think need some prodding about. Gangs are our responsibility. They're not somebody else's. We all need to accept responsibility for the things that are happening on the streets. And incidentally, I think that the Occupy movement may be astray in some places, but it is expressing very clearly a level of frustration that we look at an economic disparity in this country, the likes of which we've never had before, even back in the 20s. And if we don't address it, there's going to be very serious political repercussions. Yes?
You spoke about when you were in the State Department how it was a time where being gay was really considered a security risk to the United States. I think it was up until the 90s that you couldn't get a top secret security clearance if you were gay. How did you navigate that system and make it to where you made it being an openly gay man? I mean, can you talk just a little bit more in depth about how you navigated through that, considering that it was illegal at that time?
I'm not quite sure how I did it. I knew that there would be inquiries. And as a matter of fact, I had 3 official security investigations with the FBI. And, I said things like, yeah, I did drugs. You want me to name them? Well, there's, marijuana, there's psilocybin. What's psilocybin? He said. So I had to explain that the magic mushrooms grew in Hawaii. And I guess that like everything else, when you can be honest and direct, you're doing yourself a favor. But I truly don't know whether there were very serious concerns. I think the concerns were mainly about other countries. I was going to be nominated to Fiji, and I discovered that Fiji had a so-called sodomy statute that was a holdover from the old British colonial days. It wasn't enforced, but it was on the books, and there were strong feelings in Fiji about having an openly gay person there. And so that had to be taken into consideration, but it wasn't because of our standards, it was because of theirs. Yeah.
You mentioned both that it was important for members of the LGBT community to be open and honest, as well as your personal belief that it's not really anybody else's business, someone's individual sexuality. How do you approach being open and honest about who you are to people while maintaining a personal belief that there should be some privacy and some discretion, especially in professional settings?
Well, I think that you weigh what it is you're trying to accomplish, and if you want to move forward in social issues, you have to endure a certain amount of exposure, I think. And this is an individual call. I'm not saying everybody should come out right now. I'm suggesting that when and if an individual reaches the emotional, intellectual, and social capacity to do that, that when he or she does it, it alleviates enormous burdens. both personally and in the context of our society. So there's a value in exposing something which really should be nobody's business, but we've made it our business. We've made it our business through our laws and through our attitudes. So it's like saying that gay is not a choice. Somebody told me that Cynthia Nixon, I think, has just written a piece in which she said, "I chose to be gay." What do you mean it's not a choice? I chose to be gay. She's very proud of it. That's good, you know, and that's appropriate. But when I say it's not a choice, I mean that there is something innate in people who guide them in their sexual identity and their sexual orientation. And I say that as a person who's left-handed. When I was a little boy, incidentally, if you aren't aware of it, you know, being left-handed is not highly regarded historically. The word for left in Latin is sinister. The word for right is dexter. So, you know, being dexterous is good. Being sinister is bad. And when I was a little boy, the teacher would take the pencil and put it in my right hand, and I sat at a desk that was shaped like this, so that it was natural to do that. But it wasn't natural for me. It just didn't work for me. And when one looks at sexuality, of course, there's the Kinsey scale, and there probably is a comparative scale for left-handed, right-handed, and ambidextrous. But the tendencies are a part of one's inherent essence. So to say it's a choice, I think, is misleading. The act of performing sex of any kind is a choice, I suppose. People can choose not to do it, or choose to do it in whatever way. And that's what Rick Santorum sees. You know, he sees that it's going to be man on dog, as he puts it. Yes?
So if an LGBT advocate wanted to focus all of their energies on just one specific issue, whether it be gay marriage or non-discrimination in employment or housing or something like that, what would you say would be the most pressing issue that's facing the LGBT community right now?
Well, you know, when you consider how many people would be affected by it, I mean, in their well-being, I suppose the discrimination that takes place in hiring and in housing would take precedence over just about anything else around. So far as marriage is concerned, incidentally, I don't like the term gay marriage because, you know, gay marriage is legal in all 50 states. You just have to be a man and a woman. You can be gay. And it's very interesting, you know, that they talk about the sanctity of marriage, but they don't address the one major factor that threatens the sanctity of marriage, which is divorce. And when I was a boy growing up, the only way you could get a divorce, if you didn't live in New York, was to go to Nevada and establish a 6-week residence there and swear that you were going to be a Nevada resident forever and get a divorce. In New York, you could get a divorce if you could prove adultery. And proving it required, like, photographs. So today, you know, there's what's called no-fault divorce. I love the title, no-fault divorce. And you can, you know, get it right here, right now. So all of this nonsense about the sanctity of marriage is compounded by other nonsense about marriages for procreation. You know, this flies in the face of the fact that there are over 2 million children of gay parents right now in this country. Over 2 million. And I don't know of a single state that has a fertility test as part of issuing a marriage license. So it's not about procreation. Well, what is it about? It's about keeping people down is what it's about. It's about people's misunderstanding of certain principles that are expressed through our religious institutions. And I don't regard myself as a particularly spiritual person or a religious person, but I have enormous respect for spirituality and the role that it plays in our well-being. And I do attend church. I have great difficulty admitting that I'm a sinner. I have great difficulty in saying, you know, bad things about myself in the liturgy of the church. But I have a great sensibility for the message that we get, that there really isn't anything for us as humans to do to elevate ourselves, but to love each other. And so it seems that it all comes down to that message, ultimately. How do we love each other? How do we love each other when we say such terrible things about each other? How do we love each other when we regard each other as different, instead of seeing the ways in which we have real, you know, substance to contribute to each other? I've gone off the subject, haven't I? Yes.
I was wondering what your perspective is on where the gay rights movement is moving internationally. I mean, on one side you have the U.S. and the U.K. who have moved towards a more pro-LGBT stance. On the other side you have countries like Russia and the Middle East and some African countries who are just now passing even stricter anti-gay laws. Is there anything that, where do you see it going internationally? Is there anything, well, what do you do when you approach cultures that are just completely against the entire idea?
It's a great challenge. Interestingly, the only country in the world that I know of which provides in its constitution for same-sex relationships is the Union of South Africa. And there, you know, politically, they're having a terrible time dealing with it. It's not popular. It's not a popular position in South Africa. Nonetheless, it is there, written into their constitution. Other countries, as you point out, provide extreme sentences for people who violate their sexual restrictions. And the United Nations has struggled for many years as to how to deal with that, and they are just beginning to make some statements that it goes against the charter of the UN for countries to carry out, you know, such criminal sanctions. And it's going to take a long time, because in those countries, it is such a part of the culture, it is so ingrained that people are willing to believe that in Africa, for example, homosexuality was imported with all of the colonials, which is nonsense, of course. And it allows people like Ahmadinejad to say that there are no gay people in Iran. But I'm sure that he himself knows better. But the attitudes that you're describing are perpetuated by the societies in which they exist. And so, you know, it's a question of how change will come to those societies. I have no doubt that it will come, but it may be very long and painful. Meanwhile, you know, when you look at what's happened around the world in the other direction, I mean, who would have thought a decade ago that countries like Spain and Argentina would allow and encourage same-sex marriage? Yes?
I was wondering your position about adoption by gay couples. If you think the policy should be just to equalize it with the adoption rights of straight couples, or you see a difference there?
Well, that's another interesting issue. And looking at the rules here in the United States, they vary tremendously from state to state, and they do not necessarily reflect whether that state recognizes same-sex marriage or civil unions or domestic partnerships or not. I think that is a question that really should be addressed by professionals who have had experience in seeing how children are raised in adoption and how they might best be placed with adoptive families. It's an issue that I don't feel that I'm really capable of addressing, but it's an issue which I think has to do more with the fact that, you know, aside from gay people being underrepresented in our society, children are underrepresented as well. And children do not have the legal defense systems that adults do.
Okay, we have run out of time. I just, on behalf of everyone here, we're very proud of you, Jim. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.